Hello, I'm Mike Pothier, the Program Manager of the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office. Today I'm speaking to Stephen Friedman, Research Professor in the Politics Department at the University of Johannesburg and a very well-known political commentator. Stephen, you recently posted to Facebook a video clip showing some Indian police officers in Kolkata distributing food parcels to people in need. And you said in your caption that, to me, democracy is what you see in this clip. Can you describe for us what you saw in the clip and why you think that exemplifies democracy?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. The first reason I said what I said is that if you look at the clip, you will see that in contrast to the way in which food parcels are usually handed out, the needy people are actually given a choice. Various food items are displayed, spaced between each other, and each person who goes through the line actually gets to choose what it is that they want. And you can always imagine, it sounds like a trivial issue, but you can imagine the people who were planning this saying, well, what if we put beans in our food parcel and they don't like beans? What if they prefer potatoes? So potatoes are provided and beans are provided. The point being that it immediately changes your relationship with the person that you're giving the food parcel to. You're immediately treating them as a human being who has choices, who has opinions, and which ought to be respected. So I think that's the first aspect of it. It's also, as you correctly point out, it's police officers, which means that these are authority figures who are choosing to do not what authority figures very often do, which is to control people living in poverty, but they see it as their role to serve people living in poverty. And I thought, a very small but significant symbolic touch. If you look at the clip as each needy person passes, the police officers insist on greeting them all individually, which once again establishes you as an individual. And it really changes the entire relationship. I mean, I've written a lot about how, to me, democracy is not about so-called service delivery, it's about public service. And this seemed to me to be a pretty stark example of how public service can work. The entire atmosphere in this room is one in which the Kolkata police are serving those whom they've been appointed to serve. And it seemed to me that it's in these kind of very concrete situations that we really see whether people are being served by authorities who respect them and respect their choices.
And obviously there's a contrast with some of the situations that we've seen here in South Africa. I think we all know that the majority of our police and defense force personnel are not, in fact, out there assaulting people and swearing at them and being heavy-handed, but a worryingly large number are. So this ethos of the security forces being there to serve doesn't seem to have taken root as much as we would like it to have done in South Africa at the present time.
No, it doesn't. And I wonder whether that's the fault of the police officers. I mean, as you correctly say, most police officers and most soldiers are not shooting people in their lounges because they found them drinking beer. But the fact that some are, I think, may be a symptom of a bigger problem. And the bigger problem is the way in which this entire lockdown in South Africa has been approached in those areas where people live in poverty. And one is talking there of townships and shack settlements. Because I think you can understand a great deal about how the lockdown has worked if you acknowledge that in the minds of many people in authority in the country, ironically in the minds of a government which was actually mostly elected by people in townships and shack settlements, these are not people to be respected, as you saw in the clip. These are people to be controlled. You don't implement a lockdown as I would argue a Democrat would try to implement a lockdown, which is that you go to people and you say, look, there's a common threat, there's a health threat here, let's work together to fight it. You simply decide what ought to be done, and then you send a whole lot of troops and soldiers out into the field to force people to do it. So to me, the problem began right at the beginning, and I'm afraid at that stage it really didn't matter that the president put on a military uniform to go and tell soldiers to please serve people rather than to prey on them. Just the approach which was adopted ensured, I'm afraid, that we were going to have some of the dreadful incidents which we've seen over the last few weeks.
And there's also an intriguing kind of dichotomy in the position of the government. I mean, on the one hand, you've had the president, by and large, being very open and communicative and saying the right things. And yesterday morning in his weekly email, he gave what I thought was a magnificent expose of the way in which people have the right to sue the government and to go to court, and he accepts that they're acting in good faith when they do, etc., etc. Alongside him, you had the Minister of Health also being communicative, which is obviously part of being accountable and showing respect to people. Releasing information. I know there are quibbles about how much information is being released, but by and large, Minister Mkhize has been telling us what's happening very well. So them on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the skip, skit and donor approach that we've seen from, and those words being used from the police minister, defense minister. I wonder whether there doesn't need to be some sort of basic test of constitutional understanding and background before you get to be a minister.
Well, in theory, that would be nice, but that's not the way politics works. People get to be ministers usually in any country because that's the way in which internal politics in the governing party works. I think what has been interesting for me is we tend to look at politics in the governing party in this country as one divided between two factions, one of which is headed by President Ramaphosa, the other one previously headed by his predecessor, Jacob Zuma. And that's obviously a reality. But what we saw over the last few weeks is another division within the governing party, which doesn't fall along those factional lines. And it is a division between those people in government who feel that their job is to persuade people and to serve people and to show a bit of humility. Incidentally, I think that the Minister of Health has not only shown greater humility than his colleagues, he's also shown greater humility than most of the scientists who suddenly become celebrities who are continually passing off personal opinions as scientific fact. Minister Mkhize is always very careful to say, well, look, we're not entirely sure this is our best available evidence and we're operating on the best available evidence. But then, of course, you have those who really want to control. There's been a great deal of mirth and laughter about lists saying that you can only buy closed-tip shoes and you can't buy open-tip shoes, etc. But really, that is part of an approach which assumes that you need to control people. And the great irony we're dealing with is that the people who are complaining are the people in the suburbs. The people who the government thinks ought to be controlled are the people in the townships. So to give you a concrete example, the great debate about whether cigarettes should be banned, the Minister of Cooperative Governance, who has been one of the zealous advocates of banning cigarettes, when asked why, her first response was to say, well, people in the townships share cigarettes. When Minister Patel was asked why suburban supermarkets couldn't sell cooked chicken, he said, well, it's because people sell meat at street corners in townships. So in other words, they are so determined to control what happens in townships that they'll end up introducing a whole lot of laws which control everybody else as well. And, you know, whether this is constitutional or not, the courts will tell us. But I'm afraid there's no political process which has been invented which can ensure that in a constitutional democracy, everybody in office respects the Constitution.
No. And I guess we also have to cut them quite a lot of slack for making errors here and there in their attempts to come up with regulations that address very disparate social circumstances. The suburban supermarket here on the township street corner there somehow have to be covered almost by the same kind of regulation. And that's not an easy thing to do. Just moving on to another aspect, you touched on this question of scientists becoming celebrities and expressing opinions and calling them facts and so on. We're being bombarded with opinions and insights and comments from all quarters, sometimes from experts and sometimes from people who consider themselves to be experts. A lot of people claim to be speaking on behalf of constituencies, on behalf of labor or the unemployed or the rural poor or the business community or the economy or whatever it might be. How do we evaluate these claims? How do we judge the validity of someone who says, look, I'm speaking for so-and-so and so-and-so? Because by and large, it seems no one's actually gone and asked the unemployed as a whole what they think at the moment, or the rural poor, or anybody else. So how do we evaluate these claims?
Well, I think we evaluate them with a great deal of skepticism. I mean, at the best of times in this country, when we don't have a lockdown and we're not facing a pandemic, this is a huge problem in South African politics. Everybody speaks for the poor. The reality is that nobody speaks for the poor. You know, there is no set of organizations which you can go to and say, look, this is the voice of poor South Africans. Where it is a trade union or a business association, it's certainly not perfect there either, but you do assume that if the members didn't like what the leadership was saying, they would vote out the leadership or complain very loudly about the leadership, which does happen from time to time. And I think that, you know, when one talks about suburban people and middle-class people, certainly in a lockdown, we don't have opinion polls, but middle-class people and suburban people do tend in the main to get access to media, whether it's social media or regular media. They do have opportunities to express themselves. You know, when it comes to people living in poverty, to unemployed people, it is very difficult at the best of times, and it is particularly difficult now. But what I find interesting about what I've been able to pick up so far about attitudes, and I'm generalizing to a certain extent, and I'm not claiming any scientific validity to this. But you know, contrary to, I think, a lot of myths which circulate in the society, I detect a very strong desire from people living in poverty to protect themselves. This doesn't mean that they're happy about not being able to earn a living. I mean, that would obviously not be the case. But I'll give you two examples, one of which goes across the board through the middle class, but I think it goes into townships and shack settlements as well. I've been struck to the extent to which there has been spontaneous, and very little of this is usually spontaneous. There's been a spontaneous rebellion, in a sense, against the idea of opening schools unless everybody is 100% assured that this is safe and that people won't contract the virus by opening schools. unlike the current demands to reopen businesses, which is being led by business chambers, this wasn't led by anybody. Clearly, there was a gut feel across the society that people were not prepared to take this step unless they were assured. And one thing, one of the advantages, but the few advantages of the lockdowns which I've noticed, is that certain media are paying far more attention to unemployed people and poor people than they used to in the past. You're far more likely to turn on your television set, for example, and see people in townships and shack settlements being interviewed than you were in the past. And obviously, there may be filtering, it's not scientific, etc. But I have detected, for example, a very strong fear about getting into taxis. People are getting into taxis because they need to, because their survival depends on it. But repeatedly, when people are interviewed on the media, by the media, who are standing in queues, etc., I mean, there's a discernible anxiety there of people saying, "Look, I don't know whether this is safe. I went in a taxi yesterday, and there were too many people, and the sanitizer wasn't available, or whatever." So. While I think it can be accepted without much argument that people are taking huge economic strain and that they're very unhappy about it. I think the idea we're hearing through the society, that people at the grassroots just want to get shot of all these protective measures and get on with their lives is simply untrue. And people's behavior and the attitudes they expressed when they are asked, I think, bears that out.
Looking ahead, even though we probably are still heading into a much worse situation than we are now in terms of the spread of the virus, people are already beginning to talk about after COVID-19. And with an eye on the economy in particular, we've been told that it's going to be a huge task to get the economy back to where it was before we were struck. And the position that it was in then was pretty poor, downgrades and rising public debt and huge unemployment, etc. Some organizations are calling, as they often do, for an entire kind of revamp of the economy. It's got to become far more egalitarian and people-centered and inclusive and so on. But at the same time, we must have the kind of growth that's going to enable us to put a dent in unemployment and poverty, etc., etc. Are there 2 or 3 key steps, in your opinion, that you think we could take economically to build a more inclusive and a fairer and still growing economy after COVID-19?
Well, I think my position now is as it was before, although I think that some of the things government is saying are now pushing us, maybe pushing us closer to the right direction I think we ought to go in. I have argued consistently that the only way to change the course of our economy, which I think we need to do to make it far more inclusive and to grow it far more than it's doing before, is that we need the economic equivalent of what we had politically in the 1990s. We need a bargaining process over the next couple of years in which we actually talk seriously about what we need to do to ensure that this is, and to me that is the test. If you are a young person in a township or a shack settlement and you're energetic and you're entrepreneurial and you have ideas, or can you get in on the economy? And the answer at the moment is no, and we need to change that. Along with various other things. And to me, given the balance of power in the society, given the economic realities, the only way you can do that is through a bargaining process, which inevitably will take some time because there's a great deal of difference and a great deal of division to be overcome. I think we may be moving in that direction because I have detected a subtle shift in what the president is saying. If you look at the president's statements about the economy before the lockdown, he was talking about a social compact, he was talking about agreement between the economic actors, but it was all very firmly focused on investment and growth, only on investment and growth. What he's now saying is we need that social compact, we need that bargain, but he's saying very explicitly it has got to be about equity, it's got to be about fairness, and it's got to be about inclusion. And you might land up talking about many of the same things, but then you talk about them in a different way. Because your litmus test is not simply whether we can put more numbers on some sort of graph saying that we're growing. The litmus test is, are we growing in a way which is spreading the benefits and including more people? So I think that's the way we need to go. Recent statements by the president suggest that there may well be an attempt to go in that direction. But I think that in the interim, because this is going to take a while, I think we're going to need, clearly not as dramatic, perhaps not as dramatic as we've seen, but we're going to need substantial intervention in the economy, like the grants, etc., that we've seen over the last while or so. And I think it's going to be very important in this case, if that is an issue, to engage in a very important battle of ideas, which I see is increasingly being waged not only in South Africa, it's being waged all over the world, in Europe, in Australia, all sorts of other places where this is coming on the agenda. And that is to reject what I believe is the false notion that a national budget is the same as a household budget. You continually hear people tell us this, oh, it's the same as your budget at home. If you overspend it, then you have to repay it. Well, that's not true. I mean, we could go into all the technicalities. The main reason it's not true is that you know, if you get in over your head at your house, then the bank you lend the money from can take your house away. Most of your debt as a government is debt to yourself, in a sense. And it's been pointed out repeatedly that if you borrow substantially to fund debt, or you simply go into deficit on your budget, as long as you grow afterwards, it's not a problem. And if we don't grow afterwards, well, then everything else is a problem anyway. So you know, if you look at the most conventional economics, there is nothing wrong with spending substantially over the next couple of years in order to lay a platform for growth thereafter. What worries me about this is that we have in the society some very loud voices who only seem to get all the media attention when the economy is discussed. They are very narrowly focused economists who don't actually read the latest economic literature and who continually trot out this thing, well, you know, we've got to stop spending, we've got to pay it all back, etc. So I think that's going to be a very important battle of ideas to be fought when we do start moving away from these measures. You know, I think that our chances of growing do depend to a certain extent on winning that argument.
So maybe when the time comes and we start putting the virus behind it, we'll talk to you again about the economic questions. That's obviously going to be a long-term struggle. Stephen, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Mark.